Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Ben, and this is the Epiphone Coronet, the one that I haven't reviewed yet. Let's get into it. Well, welcome back everyone. Today's review is a special request by some viewers that caught a glimpse of this Epiphone Coronet when I was doing my review of the Epiphone USA Coronet that came out earlier in the year. Now this Coronet came out as part of the Epiphone reissue series sometime around 2020, and it was released alongside the Epiphone Crest line, the Epiphone Wilshire, and I think since then they might have added one or two historic models to that collection. Well, this reissue was based on the next iteration of the early Coronet, so this is more of a 1961 style, and it's actually based on a very early 1961 style when the models were transitioning from the old one to the new one. Now, if you'd like to hear more history on the Epiphone Coronet, I'll put a link for the other video right here. I think there's a pretty well laid out but quick history of the Epiphone Coronet and the Coronet releases over the past 60 years or so. But let's get into this model and see how it stacks up. So this guitar comes in at about 450 bucks right now, which is a pretty good deal all things considered, especially when you compare it to the Epiphone USA model, which is $1,700. Now, if you were to stack this thing up along with a lot of other sub $500 Epiphone guitars, you might notice that even at $450, you're only getting one pickup, one set of controls. You're lacking some features like binding on the neck. So that is something to consider for this price, and you're definitely paying a little bit more for this being a reissue as opposed to a Epiphone Les Paul or SG or something that they make thousands of every year, right? Probably tens of thousands of. So the nostalgia factor is definitely reflected in the price of this guitar, but $450 is still a pretty good deal. Now, as with many of Epiphone's lower priced offerings, the best you get is a box with some goodies in it. No gig bag, nothing like that. And this is no exception for this model, of course. That's right, you get a nice box that provides enough protection. I've actually never had an Epiphone show up broken in a box. Ironically, the only Epiphone that's ever showed up broken was a Epiphone Greenie in a hard shell case that had the cracked headstock. But getting back to the box here, yeah, there's not much in it. You'll find the goodie bag that has the Epiphone warranty card, an ad for the Gibson app, stickers galore, and lastly, you'll find a toe tag that says, "The guitar has Gibson strings on it." Which is a great time for me to mention that anytime that I do any prep for my videos, I always, of course, take the strings off, take all my measurements, clean the guitar up a little bit, and then I restring the guitar up with my Stringjoy strings. Now, in case you're wondering, the strings that I use are 9.5, 11.5, 16, 24, 34, and 44 Broadway Customs, which is a set of strings that I have custom tailored to my liking. And if you go to Stringjoy right now, you can also do that yourself. So thank you, Stringjoy, for helping me out with these videos. Now, let's get on with it. The design for the original Coronet was heavily inspired by the Telecaster model. Essentially what they did is they took a Telecaster, they divided it in half, and they took the lower half, they mirrored it along the neckline, and that's where they got the Coronet. At least according to this book here, which is the Epiphone Guitar Book by Walter Carter. Great book, everyone should read it if you're a guitar historian or just a guitar nerd like me. Now, if you were to take the silhouette of the original Coronet, it matches this Coronet pretty much dead on. However, this design went more Stratocaster as opposed to the original's Telecaster design. And what I mean by that is all the edges are completely rounded. There's not a single straight line on any of the edges from about the bottom of the horn, going all the way around the perimeter to the bottom of the lower horn. The only flat parts on this body are just about 1.5 inches right here next to the neck. So it's a very sleek design. Now, when I look at this guitar, of course, like we mentioned earlier, the first thing I notice is, yeah, you have one pickup. It's basically the student edition of a guitar, but that's okay because it's a P90 and P90s rock, right? Other than that, you've got this giant pick guard here, which is definitely different than the earlier Coronet that only had that half split pick guard, but I think it's great. It's a little butterfly style there, and I think it adds to the symmetry of this guitar. I mean, really the only thing that's throwing it off is these two knobs and the jack. And speaking of the jack, couldn't help but notice that the jack has moved to the front side of the guitar as opposed to on the side where it used to be. Other things I notice, of course, are the metal nameplate up at the top there, which that's something that's a bit unique to the very early 1961 Epiphone Coronets, because as time went on, they removed the brass plate, probably for cost-cutting reasons, and they basically replaced it with a silkscreen Epiphone logo. But I'm glad that Epiphone included it on here. I think it's a cool little piece of history, and it looks awesome. Now this guitar does come in two different finishes. You've got ebony and cherry. These are just regular poly finishes, not the nitrocellulose that you would find on its more expensive Gibson Big Brother guitars. Now I chose cherry for two reasons. as I'm getting older, I'm just finding that cherry finishes are starting to look really cool to me, whereas 10 or 15 years ago, I would have never gone with anything except for ebony. And the second reason is that a lot of these cherry finishes on Gibsons and Epiphones are so translucent that you can see the wood, you can see how the guitar is constructed, and that's actually really helpful for these videos, so I can just see how the body is put together, which, speaking of that, let's get into it. Like nearly all of Epiphone's electric guitars, this one is no different in that it has a mahogany body, and this one is a two-piece body that's split right down the middle. Now I can't say if that's how they're constructing all of the Coronets or if that's just how the one that I got is, but I'll tell you this, I'm glad it doesn't have one of those weird like 1-inch offset center lines. I don't know why, that just is something that always irked me. Now another thing to point out is that this is the actual slab of wood on this guitar. There's no veneers here, so you're actually looking at the real grain, which is always a nice touch, I think. Not that there's anything wrong with veneers, it's just, this seems simpler and I like that. Now in case you're wondering, the slab on this guitar measures about 1.45 inches or just shy of 1.5 inches thick at anywhere in the body, which puts it thinner than a Les Paul or even a little bit thinner than a Stratocaster, which comes in at around 1.7, 1.75 inches. So it's a pretty neat little piece of kit here. What's really cool is it's such a simple design, but it makes such a difference rounding these corners compared to the older blocky Epiphone Coronet. Overall, I think that minor change of rounding these corners has really upped the look of this guitar, and I have to say I think I prefer it over the first Coronet model, where that one looked a little bit cookie cutter to me. This, I think, just stylizes it up just a little bit more. So when it comes to Epiphone necks, you really never know what you're going to get, but I'm happy to say that this one is constructed the old-fashioned way, where it is literally just one piece of wood that's carved into the neck, and then the wings are added at the top there around the tuners. So that's pretty cool. There's no scarf joints on this neck at all, which is something that Epiphone uses on quite a few of their guitars. Now Epiphone does describe this neck as a medium C profile. I don't really know what that means, and you probably don't know what that means unless you play it anyway. But I'll give you the measurements and I'll tell you what I think of it. So the nut here measures at a 1.67 inches, and at the first fret I'm getting a 0.82 inches. I move down here to the 12th fret, I'm getting a 0.96 inches. Now, what I think of with this neck is that rather than being like a medium C, which I just think you would take a C and squish it and the upper and lower angles of the C would get a little aggressive, I would consider this to be more of a soft C if we're using weird arbitrary terms. But the measurements that I gave you, it tends to line up more with a really fat, slim taper neck, at least according to my chart of measurements that I've gathered over the past couple of years. But I'll draw a little graph up here of what I think it feels like, because it is actually a really good neck, and that's something that I've read about this guitar in other reviews over the past years, is that's a bullet point for it. It's like, wow, that neck is pretty solid. And I have to agree, it does feel pretty good. It's not too thin and it's not too thick. And what's also great is this access is awesome. I mean, literally the body lines up with the very last fret. So you don't even need to stretch too much to get your pinkies up in there if you were going to try to play something that I could probably never actually play. Now moving on to the radius of the neck, well, it does of course measure 12-inch radius, which is pretty standard for most modern Epiphone and Gibson guitars. And lastly, let's talk about the angle back, which is something that I'm always curious. Now this guitar doesn't have very much angle back. From the body to the neck here, I'm reading a 2.7 degree angle back, which is pretty shallow. And then from the neck to the headstock there, I'm getting an angle back of 11.5 degrees, which is shallower than you usually find on an Epiphone guitar. But I think a lot of people will argue that the shallower the headstock angle, the more likely your guitar is to stay in tune. I don't want to get into that can of worms because I know there's lots of schools of thought on that, but if that's your school of thought and you believe that, this is a great fit for you. Now lastly here, I want to pop off the pick guard and I want to show you where the neck mounts to the body here, because you can see that is a nice big block of wood there. So I don't think this neck is going anywhere, and you're going to get some really nice sustain out of that, I think. Like always, I'll start at the bottom, I'll work my way up to the top of the guitar, and then I'll flip it around as necessary. Down here at the very bottom, we've got Epiphone's flower pot style strap buttons here. At least that's what they look like to me. If they were like this, I just imagine little flowers growing out of them. It's the same one that you find up here on the back side of the body, and that's center mounted with the neck, for better or worse, of course. Moving up from there, we get to a compensated bridge here. Out of all the design cues on this guitar, that might be the one thing that's the most different. So back on the original one, the posts were actually mounted at an angle to the pickup there, and then you had just a bridge on there, and the only way you would adjust your intonation was that you could use these little screws here and jimmy the bridge to find a somewhat correct angle to get your intonation right. There wasn't any of the lightning bar notches on the top to help the strings individually have their own intonation. It was really just the mercy of whatever angle that bridge was at. It makes your guitar feel what people describe as slinky because your strings are literally just wrapped around a curved metal bar. It's an interesting feeling if you haven't played one of those bridges before, but I gotta admit, it's kind of fun. Now regarding the actual bridge construction itself, well, this one does say Epiphone on it, and you can see there that you would wrap your strings through the little metal hole there and wrap them around over the compensation bits and then obviously string it up at the top side there. Now if you're curious about the weight of this bridge, well, this thing's actually got a little bit of meat to it. It comes in at about 73 grams or almost 2.5 ounces, which is a pretty beefy bit of bridge there. Now it probably goes without saying that the posts, of course, you can screw these in or out to adjust the final height of where your strings cross over the bar there. So you've got a decent bit of intonation adjustability there. It's not going to be as fine-tuned as like a Tune-o-matic where you can still slide each string to a certain point, but it's certainly an improvement over the old design. Now purists might not like that, but from a playability standpoint, this is arguably a quicker system to adjust. Now moving up from there, we get to our frets here. These are, of course, Epiphone's medium jumbo frets, which is the same as Gibson frets there. And what I'm measuring on these is that there's about a 50 thousandths inch rise there, and they're about 90 thousandths inch wide, so pretty much on par with any Epiphone guitar that you've played in the past 15, 20 years. Now moving up from there, we get to the Epiphone dual action truss rod here, which is great if you want to adjust for forward bow or back bow, should you need that. Then moving up from there, we get to the brass Epiphone nameplate here, which, like I said earlier, I think this is a really cool thing here. I think it's something that's pretty unique, and I'm glad they put it on this model, even though it was very quickly removed from the 1961 Epiphone Coronet. Now flipping the guitar over, we get to our tuners. We've got 3 on a tree per side there. They're not my favorite tuners, of course, but I think I have more of a beef with these tiny little bean button things. I don't really like those, but aesthetically they match the look of the guitar. One thing that is nice about these tuners though is the tuning ratio is actually a really nice 18:1, which provides for a really nice tuning experience if you need to make fine-tune adjustments. And I can guarantee you that that is a big improvement over the original tuners that probably came on this guitar, which were, I'm guessing, probably somewhere around 12:1 tuners. You make very coarse adjustments with just the slightest turn, so these are a definite improvement. Now when it comes to the electronics on the guitar here, well, that's going to be a pretty quick section because as you can see, we've got one pickup, a master volume, a master tone, the jack, and just whatever's in the back cavity there. So starting with the pickup here, we've got an Epiphone P90 Pro pickup. Now Epiphone's made leaps and bounds when it comes to their P90 construction. Now I don't know if you've played an Epiphone P90 from way back in the day, but they were widely regarded as junk. Now they've modeled the P90 to be a lot closer to the Gibson counterpart. And you can tell even when you look at the way that it's measured. This one comes in at an 8.56 here on the meter, which puts it right on par with the Gibson P90s, which come in at around 8K as well. And both the standard Gibson P90 and the Epiphone P90 Pro feature Alnico 5 magnets. Now moving on from there, let's get to our controls here. Like I said, we've got the volume and the tone. We flip the guitar over here and we look inside, and that's a pretty basic set inside there. You've got some CTS 500K linear taper pots for both the volume and the tone there. And then you can see lastly, we've got a generic Mylar film 22 nanofarad cap in there. Starting at the very bottom, we'll work our way up to the top just like the hardware and flip it around as necessary. Now there's a small thing here, but you can see we've got a little bit of a white felt bumper there between the strap button and the body. Same with the strap button on the back side of the neck there. Moving up from there, we get to our top hat knobs. Now these are black top hat knobs with white lettering and silver discs inside of each one that says volume, one that says tone. Then we move up to our P90 there. We've got our black plastic P90 dog ear cover there. And then we move up to our pick guard. And this one does have the silver E inside the pick guard, but from what I understand, the old Epiphones had a metal E, whereas I think this one is just a silver sticker. Moving up from there, we get to our dot inlays. Nothing special there, it's just an acrylic inlay. You've got them running up and down the fretboard, and then you've also got your white fret markers on the side there. Of course, as mentioned before, no binding on this guitar, as this was a budget model then, and it's still a budget model today, really. Then we get up here to the nut. Now this is a Graphtec New Bone nut. Graphtec says about New Bone, it's tonally similar to Tusk, although it's half the price. So there you go, you got that. Now moving up from there, we get to our truss rod cover. This is actually the same style truss rod cover as on the old Epiphone Coronets, but interestingly enough, this Coronet has 3 screws because it's a modern Epiphone, whereas the old ones had 2 screws in a similar style to how Gibson does it, with 1 screw at the top in the center and 1 at the bottom near the nut in the center. Now moving up from there, we get to these white little bean buttons, which I just don't like them. I don't know, maybe it's kind of got big stupid fingers or something like that, but they do the trick, right? And then lastly, moving to the back side of the body here, you've got your control cavity plate, nothing special there, 3 screws, and it's a tiny little thing there because there's not much in it. You'll notice very early on when you're playing this guitar that it is a very tiny body. And actually, I do like that though, it's because it feels like it's just the neck and the pickup, and really everything else is just there for comfort. For example, when you're sitting there holding it on your knee, you'll see that your knee lines up more with where the neck pickup would be, and everything's shifted off to the side there. And really, there's not much more beyond that for the guitar. There's just where your hand would meet the neck because it has such aggressive cutouts here. It's a pretty cool design, actually. But to give you an example of just how small the body is, well, check this out. This is my friend Mr. SG, and you can see the SG is a pretty small guitar. Everyone's seen those, but this thing is actually quite a bit smaller than that. Thank you, Mr. SG. So yes, it is a pretty small guitar, but to give you some actual concrete numbers, this guitar weighs in at 6.12 pounds, or basically 6 pounds 2 ounces, making this officially the lightest guitar that I've reviewed to date, I think. Let's move on to the neck dive test now and see just how this guitar performs. Now for this test, I am using a 2-inch Couch brand guitar strap, which I think is a good general representation of what most people's guitar straps are like. So that's not really a good result. And I had actually read in some reviews that that was a problem that a lot of people were having with this guitar. And I think the reason why, of course, is because you've got this strap button, which is located just where the neck meets the body, but the neck meets the body at such a late point that these 2 strap buttons are so close together. But of course, this pivot point is just not far enough over to keep this guitar balanced. Of course, if this button were actually on the horn here, that would help keep it a little more balanced. And I have seen some people mod their old Epiphone Coronets for just that reason, but that would throw off the general good looks of this guitar. So now I'll run through some sounds and I'll see what I can get out of this P90, and I'll adjust, of course, the volume and the tone as necessary, and I'll put all that information on the side here in a neat little graphic. Well, there you have it, guys. That is my review of the Epiphone Coronet. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Personally, I was really impressed with the sound test. I think that the P90 was very aggressive when you had everything pushed to 10 there, but if you rolled it back to 5 or 6, it cleaned up, and even if you brought it back down to like 4, then it got this really crystally, jangly sound to it, which shows a lot of versatility for this pickup and this guitar. Now, another thing I liked is that the tone pot and probably the cap that's on there is pretty aggressive actually for a P90, and you got really a nice full range of tonal options there as well. You could bring it all the way down to 0 or 1 and just turn it into mud. Not that you'd ever want to do that, but it's nice to know that that's where the low end of the tone sits, and then it just cleans up from there. So I would say for $450, it's definitely one of the better budget guitars that I've reviewed, and that includes other Epiphone guitars as well. And as a bonus on this guitar, there were no extra holes drilled underneath the pick guard, which is something I've been having a lot of problems with on sub $500 guitars lately. If you have any comments on this guitar, or maybe you own one of these yourself and you have an opinion on it, please leave it in the comment section below. If you liked this video and want to see more content like that, consider clicking the subscribe button. And lastly, if you did like the video, you can at least give the like button a little tab there. That helps spread this channel out there, which would be awesome. All right, thanks guys, next time.